Hey YouTubers, this is the GSTV viewer coming at you with another video for you guys today. So this is going to be a retrospective look on this action-adventure series that aired on syndication back in the 1990s. Now that this show is celebrating its 25th anniversary, I decided to take a look back and do an in-depth review on this particular show. And with the way that virtual reality technology has evolved throughout the years, it got me to thinking about this show that came out when VR was in its infancy, and especially how huge it was during the early portions of the 90s. So these factors combined got me into doing this sort of review, and I kind of decided to kind of commemorate with that. So as you can read up the title of the screen, this is going to be a review on an action adventure series that aired during the mid 90s, VR Troopers. Now, what the premise is that you have this 18-year-old named Ryan Steele who's just transitioning over from child into adulthood. His father had been disappearing under mysterious circumstances ever since he was a kid. In the 10 years that he's not with his father, no one has seen from heard of him ever since. So one day, Ryan discovers this message along with JB and Kaitlin received by Professor Horatio Hart, who happens to be a friend of his father's. So Ryan, JB, and Kaitlin, they visit Tyler's laboratory, and in that laboratory, Professor Hart informs the three civilians of a breach inside the reality barrier, which bridges the link between virtual reality and the real world that they reside in. So then there's the evil avatar named Grimm Lord, who, along with his army of robots, are sworn to conquer the real world. Professor Hart introduces them with a set of devices, that being virtualizers, for our heroes to successfully transform into the VR Troopers. Now, VR Troopers was a show that I didn't necessarily grow up watching as a child, but as the decade went on after the series had long since ended, I remember discovering a message forum on one of the Power Ranger forums, actually. It wasn't Ranger Board, but it was a site that's called Ranger Talk. You would have these users just reminiscing about a lot of these similar Power Ranger-esque shows from that era. A user brought up a show called VR Troopers, and I was like scratching my head. It's like, VR Troopers? It's like, what's that? So the earliest I could remember, because I didn't even know about VR Troopers until that time, and then when I looked at a trailer online, it started to get a lot more familiar, because back in the day, I remember owning these Mighty Morphin Power Ranger VHS cassettes, because this was like long before the invention of DVDs and bonus features, and let alone complete box sets of the entire television series. Back in those days, you would have these VHS cassettes with a number of random episodes from the original Power Rangers. Before the start of every episode, you would have these previews that consist of these advertisements related to some of Saban's properties, and they would be advertising like a lot of Power Ranger toys and other VHS tapes. And then there was also another advertisement that was airing during those previews, and one of them being a trailer to what would turn out to be VR Troopers. And this was actually very interesting because the trailer did have some minor differences that were changed in the actual series. Now, one of those changes was the actor that played Professor Hart, because in the trailer, it was portrayed by a Caucasian actor who looks very similar to Albert Einstein in a way. And then by the time he got to the actual show, he would be recasted by an African American. And also another minor difference is that Caitlin's last name in the series was referred to as Kaitlin Hall, whereas in the show she would be referred to as Kaitlin Star. So yeah, there was just a number of like minor differences from that trailer. I'm not sure if there are any other ones that I may be missing, but those were the two that springs to my mind at the moment. And I could remember just watching that trailer, and it started to come back to me because I completely forgot about VR Troopers like after a couple years. Because, like I said, I didn't necessarily grow up watching the show, and it wouldn't be until a decade later when I would discover a video streaming site known as YouTube, which was still in its infancy. I happened to stumble into some full length episodes, particularly the pilot episode being The Battle Begins. So this was really my first treat into watching a show that I didn't even get a chance to watch during its original airing. And video streaming websites were still very new at that time, so it was like completely like groundbreaking because you didn't really have like video streaming websites that were there in the mid 2000s. Like, YouTube was still, like I said, in its infancy. Daily Motion might have still been around. It was very unique, just rewatching or discovering shows or movies that you've never seen before, or shows that you didn't get to watch from back in the day that haven't been in reruns in many years, and then all of a sudden, it's the memories are coming back to you. So that was kind of one of those instances. Like with VR Troopers, it was a show I didn't watch, but even thinking that I would never get an opportunity to like experience a show like this. So by discovering some of these episodes on these video streaming websites, it offered some, or if not most viewers, to discover a show from days past, like shows that weren't already airing on television anymore, even if it's in reruns. So with VR Troopers, it was actually quite a treat. When this show came out, Power Rangers was such a pop culture phenomenon. In 1993, you had the show come out, and it was very innovative at the time because there weren't really that many live action shows that were based on like a set of like action and adventure, especially when it catered towards kids, because you got stuff like, at that point, Transformers, G.I. Joe, Ninja Turtles, and all these animated franchises that were targeted to children. But live action, this was very scarce at that time, and there weren't really that many live action shows catered towards kids that centered around a group of heroes battling the forces of evil. So when Power Rangers rolled around, it just blew up overnight. And then once the Green with Evil saga came out, and then the debut of Tommy and the Green Ranger, that really added fuel to the fire in making Power Rangers from this somewhat low budget successful show into this global phenomenon. 1994 rolled around. You had Saban Entertainment, who was the company that helped operate and run Power Rangers, and they decided to capitalize on that success by creating another similar show. And the thing with Power Rangers is that it took Japanese footage from another established franchise, that being Super Sentai. So then Saban did a similar thing, only that with a show like VR Troopers took a Japanese source of another show from that country. And in Japan, you had this genre called Tokusatsu, and you would have like these blend of shows ranging with action, adventure, and overall special effects. So over there, other than Sentai, you had stuff like Kamen Rider, you had Ultraman, you had Godzilla, and then there was also another franchise, that being Metal Heroes. Now, Metal Heroes would be the source that would be used for this particular series. And with Metal Heroes, you have 3 different series from that franchise, being Metalder, Spielban, and Shader. Now, with Metalder, this would actually be the footage that would be used for Grimm Lord and for Ryan Steele when he transforms into the VR Trooper. So that's where the suit originates from that particular series. And Spielban, which was the source that would be used for JB and Kaitlin, with the 2 main characters from that respective Japanese series. and they would utilize some of the suits and props. It was very interesting, and even looking back at VR Troopers, because they actually used three different footages from the same franchise. Unlike with something like Super Sentai, or in this case with Power Rangers, they end up using one particular series for every season. How did all this come around? Like, how do you juggle between three different Japanese series and try to blend it into one series that's based on superheroes? Or at least a group of superheroes for that matter. Now, that actually was not the original intention. Now, behind the scenes, just prior to the making of VR Troopers, was a working title called Psychion. Now, Psychion would eventually be retooled to be known as Cybertron, and Cybertron would be the prototype to VR Troopers, where this would be centered around one particular hero. So the hero, being Adam Steele, the prototype to Ryan Steele, would be portrayed by none other than Jason David Frank. Now, for all you Power Ranger fans, you may recognize Jason David Frank for his iconic role as Tommy the Green Power Ranger. So sometime after he left Power Rangers the first time around, he was intended on starring on this series that was starting up at the time, being Cybertron. He would have been the lead protagonist, and it plays off mostly with the same premise of the series, with his father gone missing and no one knows what happened to him. And so basically playing the same brooding archetype of the Ryan Steele character, and even his character on Power Rangers as Tommy. So there were still some shades of Tommy that was apparently seen with the Adam Steele character. And so you can actually find this footage up online and just showing like a trailer to that series that ended up getting retooled. Now, you have this martial arts instructor named Tao, who would eventually be a part of VR Troopers. But here in Cybertron, he plays a much significant factor in this series because he would have been the mentor to JDF's character on the show. And he would be utilizing this crystal that allows him to successfully transform himself into Cybertron, utilizing the footage taken from the Japanese series Metalder. Also to note that Tao would have ended up having a daughter, and as well as a sidekick named Mouse. It's revealed that when Ryan's father, or in this case Adam's father, had gone missing, this would have explained how he ended up being taken under custody by his sensei. In this case being Tao Chun, who would have been the caretaker for Adam Steele. You would also have another set of characters that were used for this prototype of the show that did not appear in the final product. And you would have these two comic reliefs that were very influenced by the chemistry duo of Bulk and Skull and Bill and Ted, with their surfer dude accents and just their whole range of personality. And one of those comic reliefs that was originally going to be in Cybertron but did not appear in VR Troopers was an actor being Jamie Kennedy, and he would go on to have a very successful career as a comedian. You also had Percy, who would end up being on VR Troopers, but this would be an entirely different Percy. In Cybertron was intended to be Cyrus Richter's son. Now, who is Cyrus Richter, you asked? Well, basically he's the prototype to what we are familiar with as Carl Zichter, better known as Grimm Lord in VR Troopers. So yeah, there's just a number of things that were different compared to what we got with VR Troopers, and not just the name changes, but even just the overall plot to the show, let alone some of the other characters that were used in Cybertron that would be nixed out of the final product. So the idea of Tao having a daughter would be scrapped. The idea of having a Scrappy-Doo type of character with Mouse would no longer be on VR Troopers. There's just a number of compare and contrast with Cybertron and VR Troopers. By this time, JDF's popularity had grown. The Tommy character has grown as well. So those factors combined influenced Jason David Frank to return to Power Rangers, and that franchise going forward would go on to be one of the most highest rated kids shows, leaving a long legacy that still goes on to this very day. The show would get retooled into VR Troopers, going from a show that centers around one character into a team of superheroes. And that's kind of how we got to where we got to here. We start off with our pilot episode, and every episode of VR Troopers starts off with a monologue from the protagonist of the series, being Ryan Steele, discussing about some of the life lessons that his father had taught him throughout the years. And it would often not open up with a scene inside of this Buddhist-like temple where a younger version of Ryan would be training alongside his father, and how that kind of segues way into the theme of the episode. So, with the battle begins, it basically starts off with like this karate tournament that's taken place. JB and Ryan representing Tao's team, and they do successfully win for their team. And then you also have this businessman named Carl Zichter, who harnesses the powers of the crystal orb used to transform himself into Grimm Lord. One day, JB's working on an assignment. Ryan and Kaitlin are hanging out. They receive this message sent by Professor Hart in regards to a message that was transmitted over from his father. And Ryan's very confused because his father had been missing for over a decade, and he doesn't understand what's going on. How did this stranger happen to be in close contact with his father, Tyler? So Professor Hart instructs the three to head over to Tyler Steele's laboratory. It's actually located in the outskirts of the setting of the show, being Crossworld City. So they run into a number of Grimm Lord's armies and all these fighter jets and air striker coming in to attack them. So after a number of sheer obstacles, they manage to make it out alive. They discover the portal that sends them automatically into Tyler Steele's laboratory. So Professor Hart informs the troopers about this evil avatar named Grimm Lord, who, along with his army of robots, are setting up a plan to conquer not only the virtual world, but also the real world that the three civilians reside in. So as I discussed earlier, the professor introduces them to a set of keys called virtualizers, and they utilize those virtualizers, much like what the Power Rangers do with their power morphers, and they use those respective devices in order to transform themselves into a set of titanium-based armor, and together they would be called and referred to as VR Troopers. They end up having their first battle. Seems like things are going well at first. Now, here's the thing that really sets itself from Power Rangers. Because when it comes to Power Rangers, you have these group of 5 teaming together to stop a creature of the day throughout every episode. Here, you get that with VR Troopers. But here's where the difference begins. Because with VR Troopers utilizing 3 different Japanese series from the same franchise, so it was very almost impossible to have all these 3 characters fight alongside each other. So what they do to work around that footage was to have the lead character fight off against this creature, and the other 2 characters would fight off another creature from the other side of the area. So often at times you would have Ryan saying that I'm going to go ahead and fight off this creature that Grimm Lord sent out. You and, JB and Kaitlin, you guys take on the other monster, and then they would end up splitting the footage and utilizing the Japanese footage from there. That becomes a very recurring theme throughout most of the series' run. Now, they would compensate that eventually with the battle grid segments, and it would be confined in this one particular area where they would be fighting off of foot soldiers known as Skugs, basically the answer to what the Power Rangers were with the Putty Patrol. The battle grid segments would be very prevalent in the first season, but by the time you get to the second season, all that battle grid fight scenes would be toned down. They would end up utilizing a lot of Americanized footage, and as well as just original footage for that matter. Often than not, they would actually utilize suits that were basically a repainted of the Red Ranger suits from the original Power Ranger series. And you could tell by looking by the visuals of how the designing of the battle grid suits were. So it does kind of give you a bit of a clue exactly, you know, how apparent it is when you look back at a show like VR Troopers and just realize how admittedly low budget of a show it was when it came out. So they didn't really shoot a lot of original footage considering how expensive it would have been. Ryan and Decimator, who happens to be the swordsman, kind of like a servant, kind of like what Goldar was to Power Rangers. So Ryan and Decimator are kind of going at it. Decimator gets the last laugh. Ryan falls off a cliff, and there, admittedly, with VR Troopers came the acting, and you wouldn't really expect any Oscar awarding acting by any stretch necessarily, but some of the acting in the pilot episode, especially that one scene where Ryan was falling off the cliff, his reaction to it was just very cringy. You know, even watching that episode, it would like loop the footage of Ryan falling off the cliff, and then getting back to commercial break. So JB and Kaitlin had their success in their first battle. When they return to the lab, they find out that Ryan wasn't present, and they were wondering exactly where he is. It turns out that Ryan is unconscious, so they take him back to the lab and looking for him to recover. Now, the thing with the recovery process is that they couldn't have him like deactivate his virtualizer, otherwise that he would die. So the professor advises JB and Kaitlin to leave Ryan put and to have him remain in his VR suit for the time being until he recovers. So he does eventually recover by the end of the second half of the pilot episode. And we're also introduced to the VR Skybase, which would be kind of like their equivalent to what the Megazord was in Power Rangers. They would utilize like the Skybases in order to counteract some of the military jets that are being sent out by General Ivar, who happens to be kind of like this war general robot, and he sends out all these like fighter jets to come after them, and then, you know, the VR Troopers would come up with their own set of vehicles that would be introduced as the series rolls along. So they would use some of their arsenal and their artillery equipment to thwart off against some of Grimm Lord's goons, and especially in this case with General Ivar and his minions. The VR Troopers pull through, and even though it's a job well done, the war is far from over. Grimm Lord will not back down until he finally gets what he wants, and when he finally takes out the VR Troopers and conquer both realities. The episode ends there with Ryan cutting back to his monologue, just discussing about the lessons that he learned. Basically, that's the battle begins in a nutshell. And this was actually a really fun episode, I will admit. And if you could get past some of the occasional cringe acting that the series could get at times, these were like 3 young up-and-coming actors at the time. If you could get past that, I mean, there were still some things to like about this series. There's a lot more that goes on behind the mystery behind Ryan's father, and the more of a revelation that would turn out by the time we get to some of the multi-parter episodes. We also got the introduction of the most infamous pet of the entire series that would eventually garner the ability to talk human that was given to him by his father. He somehow tampers into some of the equipment in the laboratory, and then he discovers this equipment that allows him to make him sound like he's talking like a normal human being. There we have Jeb, the infamous talking dog, who would be a common character that you would see in every episode. Often than not, they would always cut to his scenes. Some comedy shenanigans occurred throughout each episode that he's involved. Yeah, I mean, I'll admit, Jeb the talking dog, like, looking back, it's like, who thought of this idea in the first place? And, admittedly, I mean, he was hilarious at times. I mean, he wasn't, like, a character that you just want to constantly change the channel by any stretch. I mean, he's no Furbus from Masked Rider. I mean, I'll at least give them that. Granted, this was like 1994, so this was just off the heels of Homeward Bound, which is also a very popular movie less than a year before this show premiered. And the idea of having like talking pets interacting with one another. So I guess that's kind of where the inspiration came from, with the idea of Jeb and his ability to speak like a normal human being. He had this kind of like Jack Nicholson voice, so to speak. But yeah, I mean, as hilarious as it was, it's kind of one of those characters where it just kind of felt, was he really that necessary? Even like in retrospect, regardless if I lack nostalgic glasses. Jeb wasn't as bad on the show, but it's kind of like, I think if this show had came out today, I think people would just kind of scoff the idea of a talking dog on a live action show, especially if this was supposed to be a show that was meant to be taken seriously, even judging by the premise. But with VR Troopers being a show that could get dark at times, so I could understand that they want to kind of light up the show a little bit and add some humor here and there. And there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but just the idea of a talking dog just kind of makes it more like a cartoon show more than a traditional live-action show about a group of superheroes trying to defend the world. I mean, it's like Power Rangers, like, oh, well, you got the talking floating head and Zordon, so isn't that cartoony enough? But I never really looked at it that way with Zordon. With Jeb, it's like, why? It's like, this dog is trying to annoy the pest out of the troopers at times and then trying to embarrass them on occasions, especially in front of all these local civilians in Crossworld City. And at times they would be very suspicious. It's like, wait, did that dog just talked? So yeah, I mean, that would also be a theme that would go on throughout a majority of the series run. He is what he is. I think if this show had came out today, I think the idea of a talking dog on a live action show, especially if it's not like a family-friendly comedy movie. So unless if it was a family-friendly comedy movie, I think a show, like having the idea of a dog being on a serious show like VR Troopers would look completely out of place if he wasn't out of place on this show already. But I mean, I digress, and I know I'm kind of rambling on and on about my honest opinion on Jeb. But granted, he's not the worst thing in the world, but he's not a character that I feel would have added anything to the show whatsoever. Granted, there are some occasions where he would help out the troopers and fending off some of the Skugs, but it's kind of like one of those characters where it's like, was he really even necessary? I know they had an animatronic dog in Metalder, so I guess that's also another influence of the idea of a talking pet originated from. So I just want to kind of get into some of the characters as well. So, you have Ryan Steele, portrayed by Brad Hawkins, and he would go on to have some success in the acting biz for a bit. He would also have some voice acting work when he's working in Funimation. And he also had some guest appearances on shows like NCIS, Monk, and even on a short-lived series called Fastlane. I definitely liked him as Ryan. He's basically someone that's really ambitious, someone that's willing to never give up, never back down, that tries to maintain kind of like an optimistic look despite being put in a very tragic situation as far as his father's whereabouts are concerned. Now, this is also begs the question about the circumstances regarding Ryan's father's disappearance, because number one, who exactly is raising Ryan throughout the years that his father had disappeared? Because in the series, it was never mentioned exactly if he had a mother. There was no mention if he lived with his uncle, aunt, or any relatives that he may have nearby the area. So that kind of also had me asking myself, like, what happened and where was his relatives when his father had been missing under dubious circumstances? Now, this was also a thing that, going back to my discussion with Cybertron, that they ended up explaining anyway, is that when Ryan's father had disappeared, it turned out that his martial arts instructor Tao had been raising the lead protagonist throughout the years that his father had mysteriously vanished. So, fast forward into adulthood, so we don't really get that kind of answer. And it comes off very vague. We don't really find out. And so I guess it could be speculated that he was living with JB and Kaitlin, and he would also be living in Tao's place. So maybe he had to rely on those three characters and having to crash into the night to get through the day and having to live in JB and Caitlin's place, even throughout the years that, you know, his father had gone MIA. That was also something that I really kind of asked myself throughout the years. And even watching this show, even as an adult, that also was one of those big questions that I think kind of leaves a big gap in the hole with the Ryan character is concerned. Nevertheless, I definitely thought Brad Hawkins did a really good job playing that role. I definitely like the suit that he had in the first season with the red and blue and the color scheming. But he would eventually get a new suit in season 2 where he would utilize the infamous blue VR suit that would be used for Shader. And I'll get a little more into that detail as the video rolls along. Ryan would eventually find his father later on, and then his father would eventually depart the series once again to return to working at the government. And unfortunately, the show never really had a proper conclusion, so we don't know exactly like what the fate is with the troopers and Grimm Lord. Ryan, I definitely, I mean, sometimes his character does get very over dramatic sometimes. I mean, I get that you lost your father, but it seems like watching every episode of VR Troopers, you know, it opens up with him and his father training at the temple and then learning about all these life lessons that he taught him and taught to his son for that matter. And it's like, Dad taught me this, Dad taught me that, Dad should teach me what friendship is all about, and learning how to defend yourself and how to never give up even when the going gets tough. So you would get a lot of like life lessons throughout this series, and you know, even though there were some good intentions when it came to deliver a positive message to some of the young viewers watching the show, so I get what they were trying to do there, and I'm not necessarily questioning on that behalf. But sometimes, and admittedly rightfully so, I do think that Ryan's obsession with his father does get a little too far-fetched. I think regardless of some of the issues I had with the Ryan character, but at the same time, I still think that there was definitely some bright moments with Ryan Steele that I'll definitely get into. And we get over to JB's character. Now, JB Rhys would be portrayed by Michael Hollander, who at the time was referred to as Michael Bacon. So I definitely like JB's character on here, and he was the answer to what Billy was in Power Rangers, and someone that was really into technology, but also really into martial arts as well. He, along with Ryan and Kaitlin, trained at the martial arts school that was founded by Tao with Tao Dojo. So he's also into those two hobbies as well. And unlike Billy, where he's like really, really into it, but JB's kind of more like yeah, he's into computer technology, but at the same time, he doesn't like go overly geeky about it. Like he doesn't speak all this techno babble like Billy does, especially in the early half of Mighty Morphin. Because by the time the later half, like season 2 or 3 rolled around, like Billy did manage to evolve out of that stereotypical geek of a character that he was presented early on in the series. His actor, Michael Hollander, would go on to have a successful career as a gaming developer at Telltale Gaming, which unfortunately had ceased operations in recent months. And I believe they're being rechristened under a new name. I can't remember the name of the developing company, but he did work for Telltale Gaming, which was the company that was responsible for the Walking Dead games. Shortly after VR Troopers had ended, Michael Hollander quietly retired from acting and decided to focus on his ventures as a gaming developer. And I could see where some of the inspirations came when it came to the JB character and how that kind of influenced from some of Michael Hollander's appreciation of technology in general. So I definitely thought that he played that character well. I mean, I really loved that weapon that he used when he was a VR trooper, where he would like utilize these double-edged blade called the Laser Lance Command, or at least the Laser Lance for that matter. But Laser Lance Command is more the name of the finisher that he uses when he summons out his signature weapon, and he like spins it around, and then he would like use the Laser Lance to destroy whichever monster that Grimm Lord sends out, whichever robot. That was really one of my favorite scenes and one of my favorite finishing attacks of the entire series. And it was very infamous as well. So I definitely really like that finishing move that JB does. That's really my thoughts on the JB character overall. Now we get over to Kaitlin. Now, Kaitlin Star would be the investigative reporter working at a newspaper called the Underground Voice Daily. And she would be portrayed by Sarah Brown, who would go on to have massive success in daytime soap operas. And she would eventually go on to have her success on General Hospital. She has retired as an actress after years of mistreatment in showbiz. She actually announced that on Twitter just over a year ago this month, which is quite unfortunate to hear the news. I didn't really get to watch a lot of her acting work outside of VR Troopers. I did see a couple of scenes of her time in General Hospital. I think the more I start watching the series, the more I start to realize as the series went on to see how Sarah kind of grew on me as an actress. And even though the acting may not have been top notch in the series, but there were some occasions where the acting was really spot on. And that episode, one of my favorite standalone episodes, happens to be Nightmares. And that would be the episode where Caitlin's kind of going through all this stress, and she gets confronted by these haunted nightmares plagued by Grimm Lord's scheming plans. Just to see like her reaction, like when Kaitlin just couldn't stand the nightmares, and it's kind of getting to a point where it's lowering her self-esteem, and got to a point where she contemplates whether she would step down from her role as a VR trooper. So just to kind of see how she invokes those emotions kind of really caught my attention. To kind of really feel like sympathy towards her. And there was also another instance in Quest for Power where Ryan was having this all-out battle. There was like this explosion that occurred, and then we're led to believe that Ryan Steele didn't make it out alive. And just to kind of see Sarah Brown's acting, like she completely freaked out when like Ryan couldn't make it out alive, or at least we thought that Ryan didn't make it out alive. Just to kind of see like the emotional trauma that character's going through. So I thought she did a really good job on this show. Like the more like as the series went on, you kind of see like how she managed to grow as an actress. And I think some of those few acting chops that I mentioned also kind of what led to the successful acting gigs that she ended up getting. She would go on to have her success on various daytime soap operas, and even she made a guest appearance on Zio in the infamous 3-part episode where Kimberly dumps Tommy with the Dear John letter. I know that would be a whole another topic for another day, but she would appear on that episode. She would play like a love interest to Tommy that just never worked out, and Tommy just kept neglecting her because he had his important duties as a Power Ranger. They had to like break off their date, unfortunately. Shortly after VR Troopers ended, she ended up guest starring on an episode of Power Rangers. And like I mentioned, General Hospital. I definitely really liked her role on this show. I mean, she was very new to the scene, one of her earliest acting gigs for that matter. I don't think she does conventions, unfortunately, but I don't know if she would ever do one maybe someday, but I know she's retired as an actress. If there was ever another VR Troopers reunion, seeing all the three actors together, the three main actors with Brad Hawkins, Michael Hollander, and Sarah Brown all doing a convention together, that would also be pretty cool to see. She definitely was the highlight of this show. I definitely liked her character on this show, someone that was really into journalism, someone that's not afraid to speak up on her mind whenever something goes wrong. And so she's the first to step up and to at least do something about it. So yeah, I definitely really like the Kaitlin Star character overall. So then we also get to Professor Hart, who happens to be the answer to Zordon from Power Rangers, the mentor, so to speak. Professor Hart, when we first see him, he happens to be this artificial intelligence that oversees operations in Tyler Steele's laboratory. And we do get a little bit of backstory about him as the series goes on in defending Darkheart, when it turns out that he was once a normal human being, and he, along with Tyler, were working on a project together that would lead to the creation of the VR Troopers. And then by the time we get to Grimm Lord's Dark Secret, there's a certain incident that happened that nearly cost the life of Professor Hart, and due to some of these circumstances, Tyler had to use some of his VR technology in order to transfer his mind inside of the computer machine, and thus becoming the artificial intelligence that we've grown to be familiar with. Professor Hart would be portrayed by Julian Combs, and I know some folks have kind of made fun of the character over the years, thanks in largely in part to John Tron and all these infamous YouTubers coming up with all these infamous memes about how he just seems to be very emotionless, and he would come up with these like weird facial expressions. Yeah, I mean, I know Professor Hart does seem to be kind of looked at as a meme in the nerd culture fandom, but Professor Hart, I mean, he does what he does, and basically helps out the VR Troopers and introducing them with some new gadgets and managing to develop new technology to help further the VR Troopers in their battle against Grimm Lord and all of his army of robots. That's really my thoughts on Professor Hart. Then we get to Carl Zichter. Now, Zichter would be portrayed by Gardner Baldwin, who happens to be the main villain of the series, and he's the business person that is the founder of Zichter Industries. And we'll always come up with some of these very questionable decisions that impacts the city for better or worse, and a lot of folks don't necessarily agree with some of his principles. He's not necessarily a mayor by any stretch, but he kind of comes off like very narcissist, like much of a narcissist that kind of operates everything that's going on in his company in order to benefit himself as opposed to everyone around him. Using the orb that he has in the first season, he uses that orb in order to transform himself into Grimm Lord. And by season 2, he would abandon the orb or destroy the orb in favor of another artifact that he uses in order to transform himself into a different form of Grimm Lord. And he would also introduce us into a new headquarters. Now, in the first season, they would use the headquarters with the virtual dungeon taken from Metalder. And in season 2, it would be an entirely original footage made solely for the series. And it would be the virtual fortress that would be referred to. Unfortunately, Gardner Baldwin is no longer with us. He passed away in 2011. But I definitely liked his role as Grimm Lord. And even though he does get a little too... like, some of his plans always backfire, even though there's some occasions where he could have stopped the VR Troopers. Like, there's an opening of a plan that he could have pulled the trigger with. but a lot of the times he doesn't. Like, they're always one step ahead of Grimm Lord, and Grimm Lord always has to blame on his minions for why his plans backfired. He does get the job done at times, and he even went as far as abducting Ryan's father by the time he got to defending Darkheart. That was actually a really great multi-parter, as a matter of fact. One of the bright spots of the entire series. And he would always have like these Skug beauties that were kind of like these like superintendents to Zictor, and they were kind of disguised as Skugs as well, so they're kind of also operating the ongoings of Zictor Industries. He also had a pet lizard named Juliet, or Julia. I think it might have been Julia or Juliet. But yeah, he would always talk to his pet lizard at times. That's really Grimm Lord there. Rest in peace, Gardner Baldwin. Then we have Tao Chun, who would be portrayed also by the late Richard Rabago, who also sadly is no longer with us. And earlier on in Cybertron, he would play off as a mentor to the lead protagonist of the series. And then eventually, by the time it was retooled in VR Troopers, his role would be significantly downplayed, and he would just be relegated over to a supporting role that would just be a instructor to JB, Kaitlin, Ryan at the Tao Dojo. He would help out the troopers at times when he would like fight off some of the Skug soldiers that invade the dojo. Yeah, other than that, he didn't really play a key factor in the show as opposed to what he could have been had the Cybertron pilot went through. It was actually the name of the setting that was taking place in the Transformers universe, and being that Transformers was owned by Hasbro, so the folks over at Saban didn't want to risk getting a potential lawsuit slapped at them from Hasbro. That's also another contributing factor as to why they didn't use the Cybertron name, and then eventually that, along with the fact that JDF was going to return to Power Rangers, so they had to scrap this Cybertron idea and then retool the entire show into VR Troopers. So as for Tao, I definitely like Richard Rabago's portrayal, like a legit martial arts instructor, and yeah, I definitely really liked him. He's very wise, very noble. He would be a mentor that would provide some words of encouragement for some of his students, and especially with our three main heroes. I definitely liked Tao, even despite the lack of focus that he had in the series. It seemed like they could have done something with him in season 2 when it turns out that he had like this secret hideout, and sometimes the characters would interact with Tao and some of the secrets that he's kept. I definitely really liked the actor that portrayed him. May he rest in peace. There was actually a couple other characters. I mean, it wasn't, like, with VR Troopers, there weren't really that many female characters, if I started noticing about it, for that matter. You know, you would eventually have the introduction of Despera, who would also be a servant to Grimm Lord. Other than that, there weren't really that many female actors on this show, the more I start to realize it. It was a very male-centric show. And I know there was Percy's mother, who was, like, barely on this show and didn't really add a whole lot of impact to the show whatsoever. Speaking of Percy, I almost forgot about Percy here. So his actor, Aaron Pruner, would portray the role of that character, and he wouldn't come until partway through the series, and he would kind of be like their comic relief, their answer to Bulk and Skull. He comes in, basically serves as a photojournalist at the Underground Voice Daily. He establishes a on and off again rivalry with Kaitlin. He would often then not butt in on the VR Troopers' conversations. Like, he's someone that really wants in on the fun and wanting in on the action. A lot of the times he ends up humiliating himself. He does something completely idiotic. And just like in every episode, it's like something's always happening to Percy. The troopers and all these main characters around him would like start laughing at him because he's doing something stupid. And a lot of the times it would take place at the dojo, or it would take place like at the newspaper that they work in. It always kind of got me wondering, it's like, are we supposed to feel sorry for this guy, or are we like, or does he deserve the comeuppance that he deserves? Like, because he's this, you know, he comes off as this like arrogant jackass that just wants attention and wanting to kind of fit in with the main heroes, and then a lot of times he does something stupid, and then some weird shenanigans happens around him. It's like every single episode that he shows up, it's like it becomes a recurring theme. But given that the show was like 92 episodes and he was only in like maybe 80 something episodes out of those 92 episodes, you could tell it just comes up. It could get really, really, really repetitive and really old after a while. And, with Bulk and Skulls, like, yeah, they had that kind of thing going for them in the early half of the series when they were just kind of like those middle-of-the-road high school bullies. They eventually evolved as the series went on. Like, when in Season 1, they were bullying the Power Rangers. Season 2, they started having an interest into finding out who the Power Rangers are. There was like the Wild West Rangers episode where they ended up saving the Power Rangers and helping them restore their memories, even though they have no idea exactly that they saved the Power Rangers. And even Countdown to Destruction, like when Bulk and Skull helped the rest of the Angel Grove citizens fight off against the United Alliance of Evil. I mean, you didn't really get that with Percy, and maybe that's a bit of an unfair comparison. For a show that ran for as long as it did, you would think that over time that we get to see Percy kind of develop and mature into a well-respected human being. We never really got that with Percy, and we wonder why he acts the way he does, and if he has good intentions, and maybe he does have a heart of gold, and, the characters don't realize it, or maybe they don't even bother to care. But yeah, I mean, when I look back at Percy, and even despite having any lack of nostalgia, through the lenses of an adult, it's like, what were they doing with this character? I think if this show were to be rebooted, I really feel that, maybe Percy would at least get some kind of respect and maybe not act as much of a jackass as he was, and show some signs of decency and respect to the troopers. That's really my thoughts on the Percy character overall. And we also have Woody, who would be portrayed by Michael Sorich. And Michael Sorich has been known for doing a lot of voice acting work with many villains throughout the course of Power Rangers, especially during the original Saban heyday. A lot of folks might remember him as Squat, who happens to be one of Rita's minor minions. He also did some voice acting work on Digimon as well. He's definitely kept a steady career as a voice actor throughout the years, actually playing in a character on the show, not doing voice acting work. He played Woody on this show, and he happens to be the newspaper chief editor of the Underground Daily. He always comes up with this sort of inventions that we'll always come up with, and he's just very zany, out there, over the top, very quirky of a boss that Kaitlin has, even despite his over-the-top antics that he would come up with. And he does have a bumbling heart of gold. Not much to say about the Woody character. I basically described it in only a few words. I definitely really liked his role on this show. I thought he did a pretty good job on it, for that matter. The role of Tyler Steele would be portrayed by David Carr, who would be a recurring character, and his father would have been kidnapped, but they do find him in the episode defending Darkheart. It turns out that he was discovered by the troopers when it turned out that a cyborg named Darkheart was working with Grimm Lord, and he happens to contain human DNA when they discover of Darkheart's presence. And this kind of led to the revelation, and at the time, possible speculation that this could possibly be Ryan's father, who had been missing the entire time. So it would turn out in defending Darkheart that happened to be the case, and that Darkheart was in fact Tyler Steele being brainwashed and reprogrammed as Darkheart, thanks to Grimm Lord. They do reunite for a bit, and even Ryan helped out his father when he was being attacked by one of Grimm Lord's goons. By the time we got to the end of part 4, it seemed like Ryan and Darkheart were together. Him and Tyler, for that matter, were back together again. But eventually he digitizes. He eventually gets abducted by Grimm Lord once again. And so the status quo is restored. By that time, Ryan just kind of feels let down, that he was just one step closer to completely reuniting with his father once and for all, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. I definitely really enjoyed that miniseries. Just everything that was going on just really got me on the edge of my seat, even though Ryan didn't know at the time that Darkheart was his father. But there was actually a fight scene that they took from Metalder, a really cool fight scene that you could just watch online. There was actually a moment throughout the miniseries where Darkheart gets betrayed by Grimm Lord. Basically, Grimm Lord punishes Darkheart after coming up short against Ryan, and so Grimm Lord and the rest of his crew start turning on Darkheart, and then you would have like a doppelganger posing as Darkheart. Ryan does get tricked by the doppelganger, and and then there was just a lot of suspense that was going on, even when I was watching that miniseries the first time around. And just to kind of see just the emotions, just how excited Ryan was, and just to see like, oh my god, like finally we've come to discover that his father's alive and well, but also coming with the expense of the fact that not only that he was abducted, but he was also being brainwashed in order to fight his own son. And just how sickening of a move that Grimm Lord pulled off, and just to kind of show just how of a despicable being that he is. So I liked some of the themes that were being addressed throughout defending Darkheart. Definitely one of the high spots of this entire series. There was also another episode, which was Rise of the Red Python, which was the season 1 finale. This was the VR Troopers equivalent to Green with Evil in Power Rangers and the Shadowborg saga in Beetleborgs. You have this character named Amy who works at this animal shelter. She ends up training at the Tao Dojo with JB and Ryan. At some point, she ends up getting kidnapped by Grimm Lord, and along with Colonel Icebot, they devised a plan to make their own VR trooper by creating an armor suit that was using the knowledge of Tyler. And so once they abduct Amy, they brainwash her. She becomes the Red Python. And so she attacks the VR troopers. She even goes as far as nearly murdering Kaitlin after she fell off the cliff, and she's rendered unconscious. While Amy does possess the powers of the Red Python, it also comes with the expense because there's this constant power surge that's going on throughout her suit. Like one moment she can control it, next thing you know she can't, and it's really draining the life out of Amy. And so eventually the troopers find a way to rid away some of Grimm Lord's brainwashing spell that's causing Amy to act the way she is. And so she doesn't find out who the identities of the VR troopers are necessarily, but she does revert back to normal, ridding away some of the side effects as a result of Grimm Lord's brainwashing. I just really feel that there was a lot of untapped potential with that character. I mean, given that her Japanese counterpart, Helen, aka Helvira, was a pivotal part in the Japanese series that the show was adapting from, being Spielban, and JB's Japanese counterpart had a sister who happens to be under the control of Despanda, or at least her Japanese counterpart of Despanda, and then she would eventually team up with JB's Japanese counterpart once again. So it does become a really big part because it's like there's always this will they or won't they between Spielban and Helen. So that plays an overarching storyline throughout most of Spielban. It was just such a huge downgrade from her role in the Japanese series that I already mentioned. So there was just a lot of, like I said, a lot of untapped potential. I really feel that much like what Tommy was with Green with Evil, that eventually once that he turned to the side of good, that he would continue to harness the powers of, the Green Ranger powers, and, he would go on to befriend the original five, and they would like team up together on a consistent basis. And I was hoping they would do the same thing with VR Troopers and having Amy befriend the three main heroes in their war to fend off Grimm Lord and his evil cronies from conquering their world. So I was hoping that they would go in that direction, but unfortunately that didn't happen. Amy was just kind of a side character for this multi-parter. We would never really hear or see from her ever again. Her actress was portrayed by Wendy Lee, who's also known for doing a lot of voice acting work as well. And she even voiced Alpha 6 in Power Rangers in Space and Lost Galaxy. She did some voice acting work in anime such as Big O, Cowboy Bebop, to name a few. I liked her role as Kiva on Megas XLR. I just really feel that they could have kept the Amy character around and maybe have another like female ally to be friends with Kaitlin, because even going back to what I was saying, it's like VR Troopers was a very male-centric show, and Kaitlin was really the only female main character of the entire series. There was just some things that I really felt that they could have done differently, but I suppose that because that this show was like a cost-effective produced show, that unfortunately they likely weren't able to even afford adding a new character to the show. So then we get to Quest for Power, and this is where the troopers find out of Tyler's whereabouts once again. He's being held captive inside Grimm Lord's cell. Ryan goes into Grimm Lord's base. He tries to rescue his father. JB and Kaitlin also make an attempt, but they end up getting captured at some point along with Tyler. And then Ryan had to go rescue the three of them. This also came at the expense of him over abusing his power, because he ends up fighting off Grimm Lord's servants, namely Decimator, and he would also confront with Grimm Lord, who he and Ryan were going all out on each other and just basically having a hard-fought bout to the very end. And this kind of gets to a point where his powers start significantly depleting, and Professor Hart lets it be known that his power is unstable, that it will only be a matter of time before that he would not be able to restore Ryan's VR suit. Ryan ends up over abusing his power and doing everything that he can to rescue his friends. And so he does rescue his friends, but also coming at the expense of him losing the ability to transform into his VR trooper suit. So by the time that he helps his friends and his father out of the cave that they were in, his virtualizer is completely destroyed. Tyler comes up with a way to develop a new suit for his son. So with the new set of virtualizer, he harnesses the powers of the new VR trooper suit used for Shader with the blue armored suit that was used for that series. Also in that miniseries, the original Skybase that JB and Kaitlin were piloting end up getting destroyed, so they ended up getting a new Skybase of their own. And also a new set of villains, with Doommaster and Despera being the servants to Grimm Lord, as well as Orcon. Grimm Lord destroys his virtual dungeon, and in turn the crystal orb that he'd been using throughout Season 1, so he ends up getting introduced with the new prism that would be used for Season 2, and utilizing a whole new makeover for Grimm Lord's suit. Quest for Power was a transition from the first season of VR Troopers into the second season, where there's a slight makeover, but still basically the same show. Ryan did find his father eventually. He ends up getting his new suit. There's some new set of villains. Yeah, so Season 2 does utilize a lot of Americanized footage at this point. And then we get over to the infamous two-part episode called Caitlin's Through the Looking Glass. Kaitlin ends up having her own doppelganger when Grimm Lord manages to devise a plan to clone Kaitlin. And so there's this doppelganger that Kaitlin has, and she's kind of showing some shades of gray in a way, because she's not fully evil, but she's not on the side of good either. She's kind of this evil form of Kaitlin that kind of likes to play mind games on the VR troopers and as well as Grimm Lord's army. And so it looked like there were some occasions where Kaitlin would betray the troopers in order to side along with Grimm Lord. and only for her to turn her back on Grimm Lord. This was also the episode where we are introduced to the VR double team. Now, this is not to be confused with the VR double team that JB and Kaitlin are known to use their laser pistols in order to destroy whichever monster that they're facing. But this is actually the VR double team where Kaitlin could clone herself. And this would be a recurring theme that would go on throughout the remainder of the series, that Kaitlin would use this new technique in order to clone herself and fight alongside one another. This idea was based off, once again, from Spielman, but the only difference is that if you recall from Rise of the Red Python, the Japanese footage for the Red Python was portrayed by this character named Helen, who would eventually break out of the spell of the Red Python, and she would go on to utilize the suit that Diana Lady was using. So, having the best of both worlds, both Diana Lady and Helen would fight alongside one another as partners, as opposed to what we got in VR Troopers, where Kaitlin could manage to shadow clone Jitsu herself. That's kind of the basis of that two-part episode. And the thing with having two Kaitlins coexisting at the same time is that if they don't merge back into one, then it will be a matter of time before both forms of Kaitlin could completely disintegrate. It's a pretty pivotal point in the show's run, considering that Kaitlin does get a new technique being introduced that would be a recurring theme for the rest of the series. I thought that was a really good episode there. And then there was Grimm Lord's Dark Secret, which was the episode where the troopers find out this mysterious artifact that leads them into this other world. And in the other world, it turns out that the troopers would learn to find out the secret identity behind Grimm Lord's counterpart. Even though the viewers at home know that Grimm Lord is actually Carl Zichter, but with the troopers, they had no idea who exactly is the person behind the avatar of Grimm Lord. And so they come up really close in that two-part episode. But along the way, Doom Master uses this artifact that causes people to turn into stone, but in this case with JB and Kaitlin, so they end up turning into stone. So Ryan has to find a way to nullify all of that and to restore JB and Kaitlin back to normal. But there's also a catch with that, because with JB and Kaitlin turning to stone, there's also the possibility of Ryan willing to discover the truth about Grimm Lord and learning of his secret identity. Ryan almost finds out the identity, but it turns out to be like a booby trap of sorts. And so he manages to escape. He restores his friends back to normal with the same stone that Doom Master had from part 1, along with an archaeologist that they were working with. He, along with the troopers, make their escape from that dimension and back into the real world, thus unfortunately never finding out the truth behind Grimm Lord and his identity. And the first time I watched that episode, I was like completely frustrated, because even watching that as a viewer for the first time, I was like, oh my god, it's like they're gonna find out who he is. And then next thing you know, it's like that's it? It's like all this suspense, all this build-up for nothing? Like, could you imagine in this day and age of social media, like 70 plus episodes in, the troopers have gone without knowing about Grimm Lord and why he's acting the way he is. Imagine like in 1995 when this episode aired, like 70 plus episodes in, it's like, how did they not find out exactly who Grimm Lord is at this point? And if social media was around at the time when this episode was airing, I would have stopped watching it right then and there, because I would just like be like, oh my god, just all this build-up just for nothing. It could admittedly be formulaic often at times. And the thing with VR Troopers is that it was very episodic for that matter. So you could basically watch any episodes in order and you wouldn't really miss a whole lot unless it was a multi-part episode of sorts. So the hype behind the anticipation of the troopers finding out who Grimm Lord is, and like imagine how the troopers would have reacted if they found out that Carl Zichter was the man behind all this, that he was the same person behind the abduction of Ryan's father this entire time. Like Ryan would definitely lose. He would definitely lose it if he had, once if he had found out about Zichter and his involvement in kidnapping his father after all these years. At least in the troopers, never found out that Zichter is the mastermind behind everything that's happened throughout most of the series' run. Everything that's been building up, building up, building up, and building up. And then you come in like Grimm Lord's Dark Secret, it's like, okay, maybe it's time that Grimm Lord's going to finally get his comeuppance. The same thing with the Quest for Power as well. But, he stuck around for all the episodes, aside from maybe like one or two instances where it looked like Grimm Lord's days might be outnumbered. It's like somehow, some way he still survived. Grimm Lord's Dark Secret would be the final multi-parter of VR Troopers, because from here on out we would have a number of standalone episodes. The show abruptly ended without the troopers knowing who Grimm Lord's identity was, and without even destroying Grimm Lord and taking his army of robots down once and for all. It's definitely frustrating to watch, even knowing that Grimm Lord's still around after all this time. And we never really got a resolution, and we'll likely never will, unfortunately. Carl Zichter, I really wish, like, if this show had to be rebooted, because, we never really got to learn more about Zichter and why he's acting the way he is. Why does he come off very narcissist? Why does he feel like the whole world revolves around him? Why does he come up with some decisions that most citizens of Crossworld City don't agree with some of his principles? And, why does he act so cold-hearted and fickle? With the way that television series are nowadays, with how they structure their episodes, like they would come up with an origin story devoted to that character, and how they developed over time into becoming the person that they would eventually become. And that's kind of the story I kind of wish that if the show were to be explored once again, we kind of get to learn more about Carl Zichter as a person, and how he became Grimm Lord. I mean, I know we got a little of that in Grimm Lord's Dark Secret, but I just kind of wish that, we got to learn a little more about his story. And, given how much of today's shows seem to kind of follow that sort of trope of a character and learning about their history of how they became the person they became today. I mean, you've seen it with a lot of today's shows, with This Is Us, and even a lot of today's comic book shows, especially in the Arrowverse of things, and even in, like, Marvel with some of their cinematic universe and their television shows. So, I mean, if they are able to tell a story about some of these characters, whether they're the good guys, whether they're the bad guys, and, how they became the person that they end up becoming today. So I definitely would have really liked to see how they would have tackled on that matter there. But then again, this was the 90s, so that trope was very uncommon for television shows at the time. So I guess I could cut them flack for that. But, I mean, I definitely really feel that a story like that could have been something that could have been potentially interesting if done right. I think that's really all the discussion that I really want to discuss about VR Troopers. I mean, it's a definitely enjoyable show overall. It's not a master classic by any stretch. Unfortunately, the show was canceled. One of the reasons being due to a lack of footage being used, since they ended up running out of Japanese footage. And so they weren't able to shoot more original footage from here on out, because that would be too expensive. And you could really tell that the show, by the time we got to season 2, they were really starting to rely a lot more on original footage. So I think if they had expanded past Galileo's New Memory, I think by that point with Saban, because they were non-union, so unfortunately, they weren't able to afford paying some extra money to shoot some original footage. Eventually, they would use another Metal Hero series with B-Fighter that would be used for Big Bad Beetleborgs. So instead of having to adapt to the transition instead of having to carry over from VR Troopers into utilizing B Fighter for JB, Ryan, and Kaitlin. So instead, they canceled the series and decided to create an entirely new show from scratch with Beetleborgs and eventually Beetleborgs Metallics with the B Fighter Kabuto. It's really sad because I really wish that they could have ended the series on a high note, but we ended up getting what we get. And the last couple episodes were definitely, really, I admit, they were really enjoyable, the last couple episodes of VR Troopers. Even Desponda also making her debut as Despera's sister. And her Japanese counterpart, you could watching that footage that they were using was portrayed by Michiko Soga, who portrayed Queen Bandora in Zoo Ranger, which would be the footage that would end up being used here in the States with Rita Repulsa in Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. So I thought that was actually really cool that they utilized some of the footage that Michiko Soga was portraying under that character, because I believe her character was the main villain of Spielban. And there was also an episode called Nighttime, or there was a character named Nighttime, I should say, and she had the ability to help freeze time in the real world, so the troopers had to find a way to undo the spell. This would be one of the very few times, if not the only time, that Ryan and Grimm Lord actually got to work together and to put their differences aside in order to undo the wrongings that Nighttime had triggered. So that episode I definitely really enjoyed, and there was some really good stretch of episodes of the last few batches of VR Troopers, and it's just a shame that it was canceled just right when it got really good. You didn't really get any distinguished names with the VR Trooper suits, and I think that was something that I think kind of hurts VR Troopers when it came to the marketing side of things. I think that might have been a contributing factor as to why, even when they came to the toy sales, that they didn't necessarily do so well. And I think that was also how the show ended up getting canceled, because of the toy sales and the fact that they ended up running out of Japanese footage used to produce more episodes of VR Troopers. So that's really my thoughts are regarding about VR Troopers. I would say I enjoyed the show. And what your guys' thoughts are regarding about this show 25 years later. What were some of your favorite episodes, favorite moments throughout the series? Would you like to see a reboot of the series if Hasbro, now that they've purchased the rights to a lot of Saban's old properties, would you like to see a modern take of VR Troopers? So let me know down in the comment section below. I would appreciate some of you guys' feedback. Thank you all guys for watching. And until next time, this is the GSTV Reviewer signing out.